Your child is in their room right now. The door is not locked, but it might as well be. You knocked this morning, they answered. One word, maybe two. You told yourself it was tiredness. A phase, just the way teenagers are. You have told yourself that 100 times. And you were not wrong, exactly. You were looking at the surface of something that runs far deeper. What you saw as distance was already a signal. They were already talking to you. You just didn't know the language yet. Welcome to this channel. We explore the hidden science of family connection, not the version you find in parenting books, but the one researchers have spent decades quietly documenting in homes that look exactly like yours. Today we are going through 7 behaviors your teenager carries out every single day that most parents interpret entirely wrong. Behaviors that seem ordinary, unremarkable, sometimes even irritating. Behaviors that seem like nothing. And by the end, something in how you see your child will have shifted in a way that is difficult to reverse. There is also a reason to stay all the way through. The last thing we cover is built on research conducted in the last few years that genuinely surprised the scientists who ran the studies. It reframes everything that comes before it, and I am not going to tell you what it is yet, but if you leave before we reach it, you will leave with only half the picture. Let's start with the explanation that feels most reasonable. Your teenager is building independence. That is the project of adolescent separation, individuation, the long and often painful work of becoming a self that is theirs and not yours. They pull away because they need to. They are short with you because they are learning where they end and you begin. You have read this in every parenting resource that exists. You have been reassured by every pediatrician, every school counselor, every well-meaning friend who has made it to the other side with their family intact. It makes sense. The problem is that this explanation, as true as it is in one direction, has been used for generations to dismiss something that is actually a form of communication being sent at full volume by a person who has no other way to send it. Here is what the data actually says. In landmark research out of the University of Virginia, scientists followed adolescents and their families over multiple years and found that what looked like withdrawal was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not disengagement at all. It was proximity testing. They were not leaving, they were checking whether you would notice the leaving, whether you would follow, whether the bond was strong enough to survive the weight of being tested. And in work led by the developmental psychologist Joseph Allen, published in the years following 2010, his team measured what attachment researchers call the secure base in adolescent relationships. The findings stopped people in the field. Teenagers who demonstrated the highest levels of apparent distance in day-to-day behavior were statistically more likely to show elevated stress responses when parental attention was genuinely, not just symbolically, withdrawn. The distance was not freedom. It was a test of the floor. They were pressing down on something to find out if it would hold them. Think about what that means for every slammed door in the last year, for every dinner where they answered in syllables, for every morning they left without quite looking at you. Every instinct you have developed as the parent of a teenager has been shaped by decades of cultural messaging that says space is what they need, that independence is the goal, that the best thing you can do is remain available without making yourself too present. And there is real truth in that. Independence matters. Separation is part of the architecture of healthy development. But that framing has an edge most parents have never been told about. Because the same surface behavior, the withdrawal, the sharpness, the door that closes just slightly too fast, can mean 2 completely different things, depending on something you can feel in the room, but struggle to name precisely. Researchers studying adolescent depression over the past 2 decades have identified a pattern that looks almost identical to healthy independence from the outside and is something quite different on the inside. They describe it as emotional shutdown, not moodiness, not a difficult fortnight. A sustained, quiet withdrawal that does not fluctuate with the weather of the household, that does not respond to warmth the way friction does, that has no texture to it, no edge, no heat, no charge. Here is the distinction that will stay with you. A teenager who slams the door is in contact with you. There is still current in that circuit. Something is still being communicated, still being directed at you, still asking for something, even if it does not know what. A teenager who closes the door without a sound, every single time, for weeks on end, who has stopped provoking because they have quietly concluded that provocation produces nothing that is different. That is not independence. That is a child who has decided, in the private logic of an exhausted nervous system, that the test is over, not because they passed it, because they stopped believing the floor would hold them. If something in that description lands with a particular weight for you, if you are thinking of a specific door in your house and a specific quality of silence behind it, that is the signal worth paying careful attention to. Because here is what the research on 7 specific daily behaviors tells us, when you look at them as a cluster, rather than in isolation. The mood that descends without warning and lifts without explanation, not connected to any event you can identify, appearing and disappearing with an internal logic you cannot access. The intense focus on something you find trivial, a game, a show, a corner of the internet that seems to consume them entirely. The way they sometimes ask you a question they clearly already know the answer to, disguised as casual curiosity, which is actually something closer to an audit of your attention. The need to be physically near you in the same room while simultaneously acting as though you do not exist, reading on the other sofa, existing in your peripheral vision, technically present and functionally elsewhere. The laughter that stops the moment they become aware that you are watching it. The sudden, brief tenderness that appears without warning and disappears before you have time to respond to it, as if they gave you something and then changed their mind. And the information they share at the very last moment, standing in the doorway, one foot already out, when you are both too busy and too surprised to make it into a formal conversation. Each of these, taken alone, looks like nothing. Taken together, they form a portrait of a person doing something extraordinarily complex, maintaining the full emotional infrastructure of a relationship, while simultaneously performing the public role of someone who has already outgrown the need for it. That is not withdrawal. That is an enormous and largely invisible effort, and it is being made every single day in your direction. Think about the last time your teenager told you something important at the worst possible moment, standing in the doorway when you were already running late, mentioning something significant just as you turned off the light and were already half asleep. That is not carelessness, and it is not bad timing. Research into adolescent disclosure patterns, including work by the psychologist Nancy Darling in the early 2000s, found that teenagers are far more likely to share genuine and emotionally significant information with their parents in low-stakes, unstructured moments, side by side in a car, rather than across a kitchen table. Walking somewhere together rather than sitting still, occupied with a task rather than facing the expectant stillness of someone who has cleared their schedule to listen. The formal conversation, the dedicated moment, the prepared opening, those are the formats least likely to produce anything real. What your teenager can offer you, most of the time, is the corner of their eye and a sentence that sounds like it could mean nothing. And that sentence, if you are present enough to catch it without making a large event of it, carries more weight than any conversation you carefully planned. The difficulty is that catching it requires you to be a particular kind of available, not watchful in the anxious sense, not hovering, but genuinely unhurried, present without agenda. It is harder than it sounds, and it is exactly what they are hoping for. And this brings us to the finding I told you about at the beginning. In research coming out of the University of Rochester around 2020, scientists studying adolescent well-being across multiple countries and cultural settings found something that cuts directly against the story we have been telling ourselves for a generation. The young people who showed the most resilience, who recovered fastest from difficulty, who reported the lowest rates of anxiety, who had the clearest and most stable sense of their own identity, were not the ones given the most independence, or space, or freedom. They were the ones whose parents had remained genuinely curious about them. Not controlling, not tracking their every movement, curious. There is a quality of parental attention, the researchers found, that functions in the developing adolescent brain almost like oxygen. It is not supervision, it is not advice, however good. It is simple, unhurried, non-urgent interest in who this particular person is, in the specific process of becoming themselves today, not last year. When the researchers asked teenagers directly to describe what they needed most from the adults in their lives, the answer came back with a consistency that the team themselves described as remarkable across different languages and cultures and economic circumstances. They did not ask for space. They did not ask for guidance or correction or expertise. They asked to be known, seen and recognized as the specific, surprising, unfinished, occasionally maddening, always changing person they actually were at this exact moment, not the child their parents kept in memory, and not the adult their parents were already projecting forward into the future. The person who closes the door without a word, who laughs at something and then remembers you are watching, who drops something important in the doorway on a Tuesday morning and then walks out before you can ask what they meant. That person, exactly that person. That is who they need you to be curious about. And the extraordinary thing is that most of them never stop hoping you will be. Every morning, when they leave without quite looking at you. Every evening, when the silence begins on the other side of that door. What is happening in all of it, underneath the behavior and the neuroscience and the careful clinical language, is the oldest question in any relationship between a parent and a child. A person at the beginning of themselves is turning back just long enough to check that someone is still watching, not to be caught, not to be fixed, to be seen. In the Devet 22, my, in, 2, my, 2, 2. You already knew something was there. You felt it in the particular quality of certain silences, in the moments when they said something throwaway that landed like it mattered. You were right, it did. The distance was never the message. The distance was always the door. Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing your teenager does that you have never quite known how to read? A silence, a gesture, a phrase they repeat. Something small that always felt like it meant more than it seemed? I read every comment. See you in the next one.